Hi, I get asked all the time what some considerations are that people should be making when they're looking at moving from within the city limits to more rural properties. So today I'm going to talk to you about some key considerations that you should really be keeping in mind if you're considering making that move outside of the city lines. Hi, I'm Jennifer Queen with the Jennifer Queen team in RE/MAX Professionals here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I have found a huge trend, particularly after 2020 and 2021, of people now migrating from within the city to perhaps suburbs or even bedroom communities, or even completely rural communities outside of the city. And it makes sense. A lot of us became remote workers or started doing more work from home over this period. And also just the impact on lifestyle that the whole pandemic had. There was a greater emphasis on a need for, say, more yard space, a gym space, office space, everything within your home. So what we started to see was not necessarily a mass exodus, but somewhat of an exodus to the more rural properties surrounding Winnipeg. So I just want to highlight some key considerations that you should be keeping in mind if you are considering making that same move. So there are some major considerations that you really do need to think about before making the move. The first thing I would like to go over really is winter accessibility. If you are living in Manitoba, you're likely familiar with just how windy it can get here, how perhaps there are some blizzard conditions. 2021 into 2022 was a pretty darn bad winter in terms of having both record snowfall and freezing temperatures. It was really one of our roughest winters, I would say, in many years. But what that meant too, though, is it really had an impact on accessibility. So if you are buying a property that is in the country, perhaps not necessarily on blacktop, so like a gravel road somewhere, just keep in mind that a lot of the time people living in these communities are getting snowed in. The wind, even if you don't have a ton of snowfall, a lot of the time because of the winds here, there are snowdrifts that form and actually block people into their property. So while it's not the end of the world, a lot of the time there are community organizations or kind of like a road association put together by the neighbors in which somebody has a plow and everybody kind of chips in monthly for plowing. Or if it's somewhere that eventually the municipality will come out and plow, just keep in mind that a lot of the time we're talking like half a day to a day before your roads are even addressed. So if it is important to get into the city for you, then just keep in mind that you might be trapped from time to time. It's not a weekly thing, but it's definitely one of those really bad snowstorms after we had this year. I would say there were probably like 7-8 days like that throughout the winter here. Keep in mind too that when you're living in these areas, you oftentimes have a long front drive. So you're definitely going to want to invest in either a snowblower or even like a quad with a plow on the front, or a truck with a plow too. And honestly, it never hurts to keep a shovel in your car too. Sometimes when we're having these major storms and there's whiteout conditions, it's actually really hard to see just where the road begins or the road ends and the ditch begins too. So it's always a benefit to have a shovel in your car in case of emergency. The next consideration I want you to keep in mind is the water itself. If you are outside of an organized city or municipality in which there is municipal water, you're going to have to deal most likely with a well system. There are other systems in Manitoba, but I would say the majority of people living rurally here are using a well system. So there's a few key considerations when you're looking at homes with wells. The first thing you're going to want to ask homeowners when you're touring those homes is, how old is the well? How long ago was it drilled? Older wells, of course, there's the concern that perhaps the well might dry up, for lack of a better term, or that it just might not be at its full operating potential anymore. Also, when you are touring these homes, what you're going to find is your realtor will often be taking water samples, and this is to test for different contaminants, mainly like E. coli is a main one, other bacteria, sometimes arsenic too, we see being tested on those tests. And what they're doing is making sure that the water is what we call potable, which means you could technically drink it. Now, you probably won't drink it. Like, well water is not the best tasting water out there. Some people invest in additional purifiers and filtration systems, which then does make the water taste better. But what you're going to find is a lot of people living rurally are actually like importing their drinking water from the city or other suburbs. However, we are testing that water because we still want to make sure it's safe for you to live within the property, say to brush your teeth, have a shower, get water in your mouth, or like cook, etc. with this water. That's why we are testing it, to still make sure it's safe. It's just not likely that you're going to be, say, drinking that water. The next thing I want you to consider are your septic systems. So similar to not being connected to municipal and community water systems, you are going to find that you are dealing with your own sewage. And I will be as brief as I can on this. But there is a very high likelihood that you will have to deal with septic systems. And like wells or any other major system within your home, there is a lifespan on these systems. So the first thing you need to know about the majority, at least, of septic systems here in Manitoba is that there's really two components. There's kind of a holding tank component, and then it usually drains into what we call a leaching field. But the holding tank in theory is what's collecting your more solid waste, whereas what we call gray water flows into your septic field or leaching field, and then releases that water kind of into the ground. So the theory is it's removing a lot of the water that would take up a lot of space within the tank, and it's kind of extending how often you have to get that tank pumped out. But yes, you have to pump out that tank, and it really does depend on tank size as well as your family size and usage. A home with, say, like 8 people in it that are doing laundry all the time and using obviously the toilets and whatnot quite frequently, they might have to get their tank pumped out as frequently as every 6 months. That would kind of be pretty quickly. But if you are, say, just a couple and you don't use water all that often, you can probably stretch it out a couple to few years. So that will really depend on you and your usage. I would say the average pump out for a family, though, is every 1 to 2 years if you have that septic field system. Not all systems have the septic field, though. That depends on the rules that were in place when your septic system went in. Sometimes there's environmental factors that go into that too. Say if you're too close to water, a lot of the time they won't necessarily allow you to have the field. So that's definitely some research you're going to need to do to get a full understanding of the septic system at the home you're purchasing, and also just how old it is. It's worth noting too that there are a few communities within Manitoba in which there is the septic tank, but then the gray water does not go into a field. It actually goes into a sewer system installed by the municipality. So you still would get your tank pumped out every so often, but you don't have that septic field that you're dealing with on those properties. And finally, there's also a system called ejector systems. Now, ejector systems are slowly being grandfathered out by the province, and it can impose some major issues for you if you are trying to buy a home with an ejector system. So just talk to your realtor prior to submitting any offers on a property that note having an ejector system, because that can be a real crapshoot. Another key consideration is really planning ahead. I don't know how many of you had that friend growing up, or maybe it was just me and Logan because we grew up in Kenora, where a lot of people lived on the outskirts of town, but where their parents would say to them, no, you're stuck at home, we're not going back into town, kind of thing, if they wanted to go visit, say, with friends. So just something to keep in mind when you're living in these rural communities and you want to limit just how often you're driving to get to amenities is to really plan ahead. I know this sounds obvious, but just make those lists, check them twice, put a lot of thought into everything. A lot of people I know meal plan well in advance so that they can make sure they have all the ingredients for the week coming up. There are other things you can do to plan ahead though too. there's something you are going to want to consider buying a generator. What you're going to find when you're living in more rural communities is the power outages happen a lot more frequently. So yes, it is worth investing in a backup generator. What you're going to find is there are more power outages when you're in these rural communities because Manitoba Hydro really does prioritize the homes and communities they get to based on population density most often. So what that means is if you're in an area in which there are not nearly as many people residing, you might be bumped lower on the list, which means, hey, having a generator to reinstate some power within your home would be well worth the investment. Or better yet, if you have a home with a wood stove that is insurable, it would be a great idea to stockpile your wood, plan well in advance so that when those temperatures do drop, you still have an option for a heat source at your home. But having that generator to keep some key elements within your home going so that you are keeping it warm enough in there and having light too, of course, is really, really nice to have. So I highly recommend investing in one of those generators. Another thing to consider is really trash and recycling. A lot of the time in these more rural communities, you don't necessarily have a service picking up your garbage at the end of your road or driveway. So what I have found though is a lot of my clients that are moving to rural communities or rural properties is that they get really into composting, and the amount of things that can be composted and disposed of that way in a much more organic and healthy way is great. They still do have some waste. A lot of them though just wait until they have so many trash bags ready and then they kind of drive them into the landfill. Another thing I want you to consider is really maintenance. With great property comes great responsibility, really, and that means there's a lot more to tend to when you're buying one of these rural properties. Sometimes it could be just more fence to maintain, more yard to maintain, perhaps additional outbuildings that need regular maintenance, you name it. There's definitely additional maintenance that comes with that. So a lot of the time I'm finding clients are investing in tools that really help speed up their maintenance so that they have more time to enjoy their property. So things like riding lawnmowers or snow blowers, like I mentioned earlier, just to speed up that process so they have more time to actually enjoy their land. Another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is wildlife. So a lot of people are moving to the country because they want to be more one with nature and experience all that nature has to offer. However, with that nature do come some nuisance animals, say raccoons, skunks, etc. You're going to find that it's not uncommon for these critters to gnaw their way into maybe your property, more often though your outbuildings and whatnot. It's just something you're going to want to be incredibly proactive about. Do a kind of spring check every year and fall check too, actually. That's when most critters do start coming into property when those temperatures start to drop. And just make sure that all holes are sealed up, that you're doing what you can to eliminate any food sources for these animals, and trying your best, of course, to keep the critters out. Another thing you're gonna run into when you're looking at rural property is determining just where property lines are. A lot of the time when you own a ton of land, the area where your property ends and perhaps the neighbor's begins is a little bit more gray area. A lot of the time people are saying, you see that ditch at the back, it's around there. You see that tree line to the east, it's along there. So a lot of the time we're given these rough ranges of what property lines are. And there aren't really as easy to search databases for property lines necessarily in all communities in Manitoba. So I really do recommend requesting a survey from the seller. A lot of the time they will have done one. And if one isn't available, what you can also do is hire your own surveyor to get your exact lot lines. And that's really important, I think, when you are determining just what exactly it is that you own. It's good to know those boundaries so that you know what you are buying. The last thing I want to talk about is really connectivity. A lot of the time when I'm showing these rural properties, I'm finding that my cell phone is dropping out of service. I'm not able to necessarily make calls or complete texts. I have to wait until I'm in an area with a bit better reception. And the same goes for some homes. I find when I'm touring, perhaps I can't send anything but iMessages. I am an iPhone just because then it's connecting to the Wi-Fi within the home and allowing me to send those texts, but otherwise I wouldn't be able to send them because there is no data really being received. I will say that internet connectivity is getting better in a lot of the rural communities. Thank you, Elon Musk. But it's still not the internet you're going to have within city limits, of course. So if working remotely and having that connectivity to do, say, video conferencing calls is important to you, it's going to be really important to do your research in advance and make sure that you have that connectivity capability at your new property. It's just something you really want to keep in mind. And also those bills can be a lot more monthly than they would be within the city. So it's just something to kind of weigh the pros and cons of those costs out. So as a takeaway from all this, I know I've said all these points that might absolutely scare you, but I really hope they don't. Like, if you are willing to navigate through all of these potential issues and country living still sounds ideal to you, having the land, having the space, having the lifestyle, having space for kids to run, or just a quieter way of life, I will still encourage you to do it. I just want you to keep in mind all of these key considerations because there are some hurdles that do come with living out in the country. However, I have had many clients move to the country and just love, love, love it there and swear they would never move back to the city. And I totally understand why. It's absolutely a beautiful way of life. Anyways, I'm Jennifer Queen with the Jennifer Queen team and RE/MAX Professionals here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thanks so much for watching today, guys. If you have any comments, please be sure to leave them in the comments section below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so that you see our future content coming out. All that feedback really helps me in determining just what to come up with next. Thanks, guys.